This is an ABC podcast.
Hello, this is CoronaCast, a podcast all about the coronavirus. I'm health reporter Tegan Taylor.
And I'm physician and journalist Dr. Norman Swan. It's Monday, the 17th of August.
So let's start by talking about Victoria again, and it's really heartening to see that the new case numbers each day are trending downwards, and regional Victoria, which we were saying last week, sort of seemed to be a cause of concern, is also looking better. But one of the things that is still a bit worrying is it seems that infections in healthcare workers are still quite high.
It's sometimes really hard to make sense of the Victorian numbers. They're not entirely transparent. They've always got a backlog. But if you look at healthcare worker numbers, they're bouncing along and they don't seem to be coming down. But they could be, but we just haven't been told they are. But if you look at just what's reported, and there are a couple of bumps along the way that could spoil the story for Victoria. One is healthcare workers. If hospitals don't control it, there's been a big outbreak in the Royal Melbourne Hospital. I noticed that they're investigating Frankston Hospital, Monash Medical Centre or Monash Health. So then the question is just what's happening with them, because that could be a serious issue, even though the numbers are going down. Regional Victoria was a concern. It looks as if that might well be coming under control with stage 3 lockdown and mandatory mask wearing across the whole of Victoria. And of course, aged care could still break out and lose control, but hopefully not, now that they've seem to have got their act together with the aged care between the Commonwealth and the state and additional resources going in. So it's not a done deal yet, but it does look good.
And then the other outbreak that we should have a chat about is New Zealand. And one of the things that we're getting a lot of questions about is there's all sorts of reports about how the outbreak kicked off there after more than 100 days of no community transmission. One of the theories is that maybe it came via contaminated freight in cold storage. How likely is that?
Well, it's much more likely than 5G causing the coronavirus, one would have to say, because it has been swabs have shown the virus on PCR testing on cold surfaces, and it does seem to survive for quite a long time. What's not at all clear is whether when you find that virus, it's actually active virus that can be transmissible and cause infection, and I don't think that has been shown. Although you have to wonder just why places like chicken processing factories, food storage warehouses and meatworks, why they are such transmissible environments. Most people who've looked at that still think that you don't have to look for surface contamination. It's much more likely to be human-to-human contamination in environments where it's very hard to control the transmission of aerosols. Nonetheless, it still could be possible. But my understanding is at the time of us recording this CoronaCast is that the freight company involved that's been accused of this or suggested that could be the problem said they didn't actually have frozen freight going to or cold freight going from Melbourne to New Zealand. That story could be contradicted in the time to come, but at the moment you'd have to say the most likely thing in New Zealand is that it's come via a human being in some shape or form.
Really early in the pandemic, we were hearing a lot about that the virus could survive for quite a long days on different surfaces, and we were being encouraged to wash our hands, and we still are. But has the advice changed about surfaces and the risk of transmission?
No, the advice hasn't changed at all, but the evidence suggests it's a less risky source of transmission than others, particularly aerosols, distant air spread, rather than just necessarily close contact within 1.5 or 2 meters. I mean, there still is evidence that it's important. Professor Raina McIntyre's study in China showed that households where they cleaned surfaces were less likely to transmit the virus, but they were doing other things as well. They were wearing masks at home and they were socially distancing. So it's hard to produce cause and effect. And where this comes from is SARS-1, where surfaces did seem to be important in healthcare settings. And remember, healthcare settings are intense transmission environments. And we on CoronaCast, you and I, Tegan, right at the beginning, described a case study in Singapore of 3 patients with COVID-19 in single rooms in a Singaporean hospital. 2 were quite sick and 1 was only mildly sick. And the one who was mildly sick was spraying the virus everywhere. I mean, the virus was in the toilet. It was on the cupboards where the staff were getting PPE equipment. It was scary stuff. And of course, if there's fresh virus in large amounts, then maybe you could catch the virus there. And even in SARS-1, where they thought it was transmitted via contact with surfaces, and they've looked at some of those examples outside healthcare settings, even now it starts to look as if those could be aerosol spread rather than surface spread. So surfaces, we should just all be really careful. We should still be cleaning everything down. When you come back from the supermarket, get rid of the packaging, wash your hands. But I think it's masks that are going to be much more protective than surfaces. But what's the cost? To be really careful about surfaces, the cost is really low. So the advice has not changed. It's just the risk is probably a bit lower. Now, Tegan, this is a question for you, because you've been looking at this. We keep on getting questions. Has a new strain of the coronavirus appeared? And you've been getting into the weeds on this one.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is weedy. There's a lot to get through here. But basically, the question is, has the coronavirus mutated to a form where maybe it's more virulent or harder to vaccinate against or more easily transmissible? And the short answer to that is no. But yes, so no, it's not worse than it was when it first emerged in Wuhan last year. But yes, it has mutated over time because viruses do. But one of the good things about this pandemic is that it's a coronavirus rather than an influenza virus. And coronaviruses don't mutate anywhere near as rapidly as influenza viruses do. So, I mean, listeners would probably know that one of the reasons we've got to get a flu shot each year is because the flu mutates so quickly that you just don't have lasting immunity to what you've been vaccinated against. But coronaviruses are much slower in mutating. And one of the reasons why there's been some headlines around this recently that might have sort of piqued people's interest is that there's one particular mutation called D614G, which is on the spike protein of the coronavirus, which is the part of the virus that allows it to enter your cells. And it's also the target for all of the vaccines that are being developed. So there is a concern that if it was changing that spike protein in a key way, it might stop a vaccine from being effective. The good news is it's in a different part of the spike protein and we're fine. And basically overall, the biology of the virus that's circulating now is pretty much exactly the same as it was when it first emerged in Wuhan last December. So while there have been small changes that we can see when we're sequencing the genome of the virus, it's not materially different to the way it was. And at this stage, there's nothing to worry about in terms of mutation.
And this leads into our final story today, which is a research story today of a fishing trip. Now, just warning here, this is a non-peer-reviewed study. Nobody's run the ruler over it yet to actually check that it's valid and all the methodology was right, but it looks pretty good. But it's a small study. So this was a study where they actually tested people getting on a fishing boat. So there's about 122 people on board, and they tested them everybody before they got on board, both no swabs for the virus and also antibodies. And this is because, fishing boats like a cruise ship times 10, tiny little vessel, or a relatively small vessel, and they wanted to make sure people weren't infected before they got on. Turns out that one of them was infected, and about day 18 got quite sick and had to go back into hospital. And then they monitored the rest of the people on the boat afterwards up to nearly 2 months, on an average of 1 month, but up to nearly 2 months.
And heaps of them got it. A massive amount of the crew members got it.
That's right. Almost all of them got it. Really very large numbers, except 3 people on the boat didn't catch it. And they were the ones who got on the boat, and their blood test showed that they had what's called neutralizing antibodies. So these are antibodies which in theory are the ones which attack the virus, particularly the spike protein, which stops it attaching to cells in the body. And they had these neutralizing antibodies. They're also the antibodies that vaccines that are being developed around the world are supposed to be generating. So it is a small study, not peer-reviewed, but bottom line here is that if this study is real and the effect on these 3 people is real, then it's likely that it's more comfort, I suppose, that the vaccines which are producing neutralizing antibodies are going to protect people against the virus. So pinch of salt, but a nice pinch of salt.
So it shows that a vaccine might be effective, but we've also heard people say that you might be able to give antibodies to other people. Are these the sort of antibodies that you might be able to give to someone to protect them?
Yeah, essentially it's called convalescent serum. You take people who've had the infection, particularly slightly more severe infection, hopefully they've got more antibodies on board, then you give that back to people in hospital. Some people are trying to develop antibodies, monoclonal antibodies, which might mimic some of these, and it's too early to say whether or not they have benefit. There's been mixed results from studies so far, and the jury's still out.
Well, it's all we've got time for in CoronaCast today. But if you like us, why not tell a friend and leave us a review on Apple Podcasts if you can.
If you want to ask us a question, please do. Go to abc.net.au/coronavirus. Go to ask us your questions and fill in the form and mention CoronaCast so we can pick it up. And please leave us a comment if you can. And we'll see you tomorrow.
See you then.